aristocrat, bred to be a leader, was offered command of the Union Army in the Civil War, but he turned it down and cast his fate with the South. His name, Robert E. Lee. At about the same time, this man of undistinguished background offered his services to the Union Army, and because of his tarnished reputation, received no interest, no reply. His name, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant and Lee, the story of two men who went to war. Two men whose inner struggles and personal conflicts led them to one of history's climactic moments, the surrender at Appomattox. A rag doll, an unlikely witness to the last act in a great historic drama, and so is the setting. But this is how it looked. The simple home of the McLean family in Appomattox, Virginia, over a century ago. Here, two remarkable men, Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant, entered that room and reached a lasting peace which made us come of age as a nation. Now we'll return to that time, observing the events largely as newsreel cameras might have recorded them had they existed during the Civil War. A story of two men involved in war and peace. A peace which a nation weary of bloodshed desperately wanted, but didn't know how to find.
Fire!
For 3 years, one nation had been fighting not an outside enemy but itself. North against South, in a war generated by regional and economic differences and triggered by the issue of slavery. Both sides had banked on a quick victory, but war rarely bows to the hopes of men, and they find themselves in a drawn-out conflict with casualty lists that haunt the conscience and no end in sight.
This war is wicked and cruel, not waged for the preservation of the Union, but for the purpose of crushing out liberty.
Now the endless rifle fire on the fields of Virginia is echoed by voices of dissent within the North itself. It's led by Ohio Congressman Clement Vallandigham, opposition Democrat and firebrand Copperhead.
If the South can hold out through this 1 year, the Peace Party of the North will sweep the Lincoln dynasty out of political existence.
I'm for a cessation of hostilities. This war goes on. We shall have no liberty, no union, no republic. We should restore the Union without further loss of blood.
In July 1863, Northerners take to the streets to protest the war. The New York draft riots will leave over 1,000 people killed and wounded. The burden falls heaviest on Lincoln, man of many burdens. Advisors warn he could lose next year's election if he continues the war. Lincoln, however, is committed to preserving the Union, and he knows the North's manpower and industrial muscle should be able to defeat the agrarian South. But in 1 year, he's gone through 5 generals, and none could crush the Confederacy. In the midst of this crisis, on March 8, 1864, in the chill of late afternoon, a strange figure arrives in Washington, D.C. without a trace of fanfare. He's accompanied by his 13-year-old son, For beneath the grizzled exterior, Ulysses S. Grant is withdrawn and uneasy among strangers, never happy when separated from his family. But he's been summoned here by President Lincoln to play a remarkable role after virtually a lifetime of failure and obscurity. 2 decades before, Grant, an undistinguished graduate of West Point with no dreams of military glory, got his first taste of combat in the Mexican War. Grant felt the war was an imperialistic land grab, but still he served with some distinction. He was far overshadowed, however, by a young officer he met once or twice briefly, Robert E. Lee. He always remembered the dashing captain from Virginia. For even then, Lee bore the mantle of potential greatness, the favorite of General Winfield Scott, the Mexican War a testing ground for Lee's military brilliance. While for Grant, the war was just a momentary highlight before sinking back into peacetime obscurity. After the Mexican War, bored with barracks life, Grant was forced to resign from the Army for drinking, and life began to slip through his fingers. In Missouri, after failing at farming, he tried to support his young family by selling real estate, but he lacked the temperament for smooth dealings. Finally, he was forced to accept charity, a job in a small town in Illinois as clerk in his father's harness shop. And some say Grant found solace in the bottle, one of those men with loser written all over him. For Grant, the future looked like an endless procession of failure and humiliation.
Okay, come in, hold. 1, 2, hold up, hold. In place, breath.
But the start of the Civil War gave a chance to all kinds of men. And it's the ironic turning point in Grant's life. He offered his services to the regular army, and probably because of his dubious record, got no reply. But though he didn't even own a uniform, he drifted into training some ragtail Illinois volunteers. Anything was better than working in his father's leather shop. The expanding army gave Grant a last chance in life. For though he was helpless in the subtleties of business, he had an inner core hard and basic as a gun barrel. And once commissioned a colonel, then a brigadier, he started to move. Within a year, Grant began a string of stunning victories in the West. First Fort Henry, then Fort Donelson with a ringing challenge of unconditional surrender, followed by victories at Vicksburg and Chattanooga in relentless, supremely confident style. It was an astonishing performance for an unknown general, and it brought Grant finally to Washington, D.C., summoned by the president. Lincoln happens to be holding a social reception the night Grant arrives at the White House, but Grant's Midwestern impulse is to fear and hate the capital for its sophistication and political intrigue, even though he's regarded here as a great war hero, a major general destined for an even greater role. Now Lincoln will give him the awesome responsibility of fighting the main war in the East, where it must be won in the fields between Washington and Richmond, barely 100 miles apart. He gives Grant command of all the Union armies.
3 cheers for General Grant.
March 1864. With absolute trust, Lincoln gives Grant what he has given no other general: freedom to wage the war without White House interference. He senses in Grant a will of iron, and despite the rumors, the strength to handle his liquor now that he has found himself as a man. With the fate of a nation hanging in the balance, history has a way of placing awesome responsibility in the hands of unlikely men. A former rail splitter with a genius for politics, and a former clerk with a genius for war. Cutting through the politics and incompetence that had hamstrung the Army for so long, Grant puts together a lethal team to take the field against the South. Among them, General Philip Sheridan, former Indian fighter and cavalryman, as sharply honed and dangerous as a bayonet. William Tecumseh Sherman, a general with the cold eyes of a hangman, will take Grant's place in the West. Sherman privately believes in the subjection of the Negro, but he's a loyal and daring fighter, Grant's favorite lieutenant. Grant is eager to roll. With mathematical precision, he outlines his strategy. The art of war is simple enough, he says. Strike at the enemy as hard as you can and as often as you can and keep moving on. From now on, all Union armies will move together, like a coordinated machine. The war boils down to one thing: smash the Confederate armies, annihilate them once and for all. On May 4th, 1864, Grant will lead the Army of the Potomac straight for the Army of Northern Virginia and its commander, Robert E. Lee. He knows that many of his own officers have already tangled with Lee, and some doubt Grant's ability against the almost invincible Virginian. But as Grant puts it, I had known Lee personally, and I knew that he was mortal. Robert E. Lee waits for the Union Army pouring into Northern Virginia. He knows its new general will outnumber him almost 2 to 1. But Grant holds no terrors for him, for Lee has already repulsed 4 major Union offensives, and something in him responds to the exhilaration of war. It's well that war is so terrible, he once said, or we should grow too fond of it. A charismatic figure, Lee is the antithesis of Grant, as general and man. Even as a young man, long before the Civil War, Lee was conscious of a special role in life. His family roots went deep into the history of Virginia. Father of 7 children, the son of a Revolutionary War hero, Light Horse Harry Lee, he was married to Mary Custis, great-granddaughter of Martha Washington. As head of this eminent family, Lee achieved an exalted status in the South, a symbol of its aristocratic best. His good fortune is marred only by the early sickness of his wife, who becomes an invalid, which serves to deepen their devotion. But the specter of slavery troubled Lee's conscience. He personally found it inhuman and repugnant. Yet its fate must be left, he felt, in the hands of God. Beneath this surface contentment, however, slavery threatened war. And because of his prestige, Colonel Lee was offered command of all the Union forces. The offer, initiated by General Winfield Scott, Lee's former commander.
I thought that if we put Lee in front of a powerful army, we could prevent the war. I knew he didn't want the war. Thought it'd be a tragic business. As for the slavery, I'd heard that he had freed his Negroes since. Anyway, he came down to Washington and he listened to the offer. Command of all of the Union forces, and he turned it down. He was an American, but he was a Virginian first. I remember we talked man to man. After all, I'm a Virginian too, and I said to him, Lee, you've made the greatest mistake in your life.
But as a loyal Virginian, Lee felt he had no other choice. Now defender of a vanishing way of life, idol of the Confederacy, he prepares to test Grant's mettle for the first time. Lee will face an enemy twice his size, backed by 5 times as much industry and almost unlimited resources. But beneath the austere dignity and a deep faith that somehow he is God's instrument, there's a streak of the riverboat pirate in Lee. And to offset the North's monolithic might, his weapons are audacity, lightning maneuvers, surprise. On May 14th, 1864, the stage is set for the clash of giants. And this is where it would take place, the wilderness in Northern Virginia. A terrible place for battle, more jungle than woods, where advantage in numbers would be drastically reduced and artillery all but useless, where visibility is barely 50 yards in any direction, and Grant's men feel a sense of ominous dread. Grant planned to push through here swiftly, of course, with the idea of meeting Lee in open country further south. But Lee, the Fox, rarely fought on the enemy's terms. A contemporary account said it all. Two wild animals were hunting each other. When they heard each other's steps, they sprung and grappled. Here in blind wrestle, as at midnight, did 200,000 men in blue and gray clutch at each other. Bloodiest and weirdest of encounter. War had had nothing like it. Of battle, Lee recklessly exposes himself to enemy fire to rally his rebels against the Union Army, which is somehow held firm. He inspires one officer to say, "I'd charge hell itself for that old man." And only the urging of his own men makes Lee withdraw from the front lines and the awful carnage. Then an ominous lull. Grant's men have been mauled in perhaps the most savage fighting of the war. Their new commander has led them into a nightmare no better than all his predecessors. And they expect to be pulled back.
Bad as anything I've seen. Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, anything. You get up to advance, you get hit. You get up to run, you get hit.
If we lie here long enough, we'll get hit too.
They'll move us out. They gotta move us out. They'll pull us back, that's for sure.
Grant has just lost 17,000 soldiers killed and wounded in one battle. This complex man, who's still so sensitive about blood that he can eat meat only if it's charred, whose incessant whittling and smoking 20 cigars in a single day were the only outward signs of inner pressure. But perhaps no one in the history of warfare can shoulder with more apparent detachment the lonely burden of sending men to die. Now, when all his men expect him to retreat, he orders an advance. Still battered and dazed, the Union Army pushes on, but with a growing admiration for their new commander. For Grant's leading them out of the wilderness, sidestepping further south, forcing Lee closer to the Confederate capital, Richmond. This is something new. A Union commander who gets whipped yet keeps coming. Lincoln has at last found himself a general. Lee is stunned. Grant is still coming on like a barroom brawler who won't go down. With the South drained by 3 years of fighting, his men are hungry, the ranks dwindling. The last thing Lee can afford is to trade casualty for casualty, man for man with Grant. On the eve of the next savage battle, Grant's men, realizing what they're in for, pin their names and addresses on their own backs, so their bodies will be identified if the worst happens. And it does. 2 more nightmarish battles, Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor. In his first month against Lee, Grant loses 60,000 men, killed and wounded, as much as Lee's whole army. But the price Grant feels he must pay for victory arouses revulsion. Many in the war-weary North begin to call Grant a butcher for playing a numbers game in death, a wholesale murderer of his men. Grant the butcher. Attacked by elements on his own side for seeking victory in a war that's growing increasingly more unpopular, Grant, as usual, buries whatever feelings he has deep within himself and pushes further south, moving on Lee at Petersburg. Back door to Richmond, jugular vein of the Confederacy, and a fortress within which lurks the darkest days of the war. June 1864. The Civil War has entered its 4th year, and the fighting in Virginia develops into something virtually new in history: trench warfare. The ghastly siege of Petersburg, less than 20 miles from Richmond. Behind the earthworks, the Army of Northern Virginia is battered by death, disease, and desertion. Those who stay and survive call themselves Les Miserables. Unable to maneuver, Lee is pushed into the worst possible position. Forced to defend the city and its railroad line, the most vital supply artery in the Confederacy. Like a boxer, he's cornered against the ropes, pounded incessantly. But Grant, too, is in a dangerous position. Unable to crack Lee's defenses, at some points barely 100 yards away, and still bearing the stigma of butcher, he's locked in a siege that will be costly in more human blood. And while he faces Lee in front, enemies are at work behind his back with mounting hostility in the north. Anti-war copperheads engage in terrorism, planning to burn New York hotels, destroy bridges, fight the draft, encourage desertion. Aided by the South and with several 100,000 sympathizers, they've even plotted an armed uprising in the North. Anything to strengthen the anti-war Democratic Party and spread defeatism in the Union. Another specter generates increased anti-war feeling in the North: the prisoner of war issue. Over 22,000 Union men are dead or dying in Confederate prison camps. Even more rebels will die in northern camps. And everywhere is heard the plea, we want our boys home. In the face of mounting pressures, Lincoln meets with Grant at the siege. The president fears that boiling anger over the war and Grant's meat grinder tactics will cost him the election only a few months away. Virtually any other president in history would bow to these pressures and change course. But Lincoln can never consent to dividing the country into 2 nations. And he has faith in Grant, this silent soldier who shares Lincoln's burden and his vision. As they face perhaps the greatest crisis of the war, he tells Grant, hold on with a bulldog grip and chew and choke as much as possible. Now begins a war of nerves, a test of will. If Lee and his torn army can persevere just a bit longer, he hopes that the North, divided against itself, will at last lose the will to win, and that Lincoln will go down to defeat. So Lee must generate the sheer force of personality to hold his men in the Confederacy together, despite a private anguish. One of his own sons has been wounded and captured. A daughter has died. But Lee, the general, cannot afford the luxury of grief when all depends on him.
Marsh Robert, he always pulled us in before. He'll do it again.
The Bluebellies just gotta come to their senses.
We don't want nothing from them, except our freedom. I rode with Lee, and it's like he said, the way they're going, that Lincoln fellow just can't win. Come November.
Those Confederate hopes go up in flames, however, when Grant sends one of his grim horsemen, General Sherman, on a daring run behind Lee. Burning Atlanta, Sherman marches to the sea, destroying everything in his path. Civilians suffer deeply, but Grant reasons if bullets can't crush the Confederacy, fire and hunger will. These victories in the South ensure Lincoln's re-election, and Grant can now press the conflict to the end. But the Petersburg siege grinds on, and Grant will not endure it alone. This man who trades in death needs respite from the toll of war and a child's companionship and a woman's warmth.
Sometimes being a woman here has its problems. One night we were menaced by 6 Confederate gunboats, and someone knocked at our door to warn us. You remember that, Jesse? Well, the general threw on his clothes, and I followed, and at first it looked like we were going to have to make a fight of it. So I asked Ulysses, what had I better do? Well, he was very busy at the time, and all he could say to me is, well, the fact is, Julia, you hadn't ought to be here at all.
You're not worried about bringing your children so close to the fighting?
Oh, no, not especially. After all, Alexander the Great accompanied his father, Philip of Macedon, when he was no older than Fred, and there was no one prouder than Fred at 13, riding with the general at Vicksburg and wearing his father's sword.
For Mrs. Robert E. Lee, however, the war meant only separation from her husband and a horizon of darkening skies, as she recalled years later.
With the cause going so badly, I'm afraid General Lee also had to worry about me. I was in Richmond and confined to my rolling chair even then. You know, when I was sick and low on food, he'd send me all he could. A few lemons, a handful of apples, a pear. It was all there was in Petersburg. General Lee was strongly opposed to that war when it began, as was I. And although everybody said he was a born general, he was a very gentle person. Actually, he preferred the company of women to men. Oh, not romantically, of course. He just seemed more at ease and more at home with women. I guess it was because, as a young man, he spent a great deal of time caring for his mother. She was an invalid. And then caring for me.
Once, during the awful siege of Petersburg, the general comes home briefly to see Mrs. Lee, and his customary reserve parts like a curtain for a moment. And it reveals in his grim face that the warrior, and not the invalid wife, is the one who needs comfort. Lee came here to see the Virginia members of Congress to tell them his men had no food. Then he tells his wife, with a bitterness that he almost never reveals to anyone, that they did nothing. Just sat there, ate peanuts and chewed tobacco. At times, Lee recognizes that the South is doomed, but then buries his fears beneath the soldier's pride. The cool battlefield strategist begins to vacillate and grasp at straws. Locked by Grant in a death grip, Lee will carry a desperate plea to President Jefferson Davis for more food, more guns, more men. But the Confederacy refuses to face reality.
President Davis, would you care to comment on reports that the war is going badly for the Confederacy?
Gentlemen, if there's any who believes our cause is in danger, that we can no longer supply our troops and our people, then I would take them to those places where our brave men are facing the foe. And there you get your assurance of our final success.
What about the possibility of a negotiated peace, sir?
There's but one means that I can consider for our independence and an honorable peace. And that is that we fight those battles and achieve those victories that will prove to the world that we can defend our rights, and to the Yankee nation that it's death to invade them.
Almighty and everlasting God, who makest wars to cease unto the ends of the earth, we praise and magnify that great mercy whereby thou...
Lee has little to sustain him now except his faith. Almost against his will, he went to war against his own country. staked life, reputation, and honor for a cause. And now its leaders give him merely rhetoric to face Grant's guns. But Lee has gone too far to turn back. And whatever bitterness, whatever anguish he inwardly feels, he must keep his silence and maintain the image of a Confederate knight, for he's all that the South has left. Finally, winter brings its own bitterness to the siege. All his life, Lee has idolized George Washington, who grasped victory out of the darkness of Valley Forge. And he once felt that he, too, could win a war against overwhelming odds by sheer force of will and spirit. That was an illusion, and now it's crumbling, along with Lee's once rugged health, which has been drained by the war. But Lee, a soldier who regards duty as sacred, must stay here and wait for spring and Grant's inevitable offensive. The commander of an army, Lee is the prisoner of his role. On April 3rd, 1865, after long months of bloodshed, the siege of Petersburg ended in silence. Spring had brought new life to the land. It also brought a new Grant offensive and death to Lee's men. Knowing he was outnumbered 4-1, Lee and his army slipped away in the night. He hoped to link up with another Confederate force and keep the lost war going. So commenced the final drama of the Civil War. In retreat, Robert E. Lee tries desperately to keep his army from disintegrating. But his men have begun to obey a higher authority, exhaustion and starvation. The rebel tide begins to straggle and desert. For who wants to be the last to die in a war whose end is in sight? Even Lee's trusted general, Richard Ewell, old Baldhead, has had enough and surrenders. Ewell gave a leg to the cause, followed Lee faithfully through Gettysburg and the wilderness, but now delivers a grim judgment.
The cause is lost. For every man that's killed from now on, somebody is responsible. And it will be little better than murder. War is over. It is over.
Under relentless pressure, Lee himself begins to wrestle with that moral dilemma. He's received an ultimatum from Grant to surrender, and his answer was no. But he left the door open, asking what terms Grant would offer. For Lee finds himself torn. Must his men continue to die in a cause already lost? Yet war has a momentum of its own, swaying men's judgment, carrying them along against all reality, even the leaders.
I was General Lee's artillery commander, and at one time during the retreat, he seemed to want some kind of end to the fighting. So I told him that 5 of his generals and I had met privately and concluded we were beaten. There was no point to shed more of our men's blood. I'll never forget how he glared at me and said we have too many brave men to think of laying down our arms. They still fight with spirit. And he ended with, we must all determine to die at our posts.
The night of April 8th. Lee holds a war council with Generals Longstreet, Gordon, and Fitz-Lee, a nephew. The old soldier is still too proud to give up, still clings to shreds of hope that somehow his 4 years of war must have some meaning and can't be abandoned even now. He plans for the morning, a desperate attack to cut through Grant's grip. If that fails, then they'll surrender. That same night, Grant makes headquarters barely a few miles away. Sensing final victory, his officers thump away on an old piano downstairs. Upstairs, Grant, his head splitting with a migraine from the pressure of a war not quite won, bathes his feet in hot water and mustard. And so, with the end in sight, the commander of all the Union armies spends the night enduring a blinding headache and an out-of-tune piano. The morning of April 9th. After sleeping in the field near a town called Appomattox Courthouse, Lee's officers prepare breakfast, a handful of cornmeal boiled in a shaving can. On this day, Lee makes a strangely resplendent appearance, and General Pendleton, who privately has a thought that Lee has dressed for his own death, comments on the new uniform: hat, gauntlets, shining boots, ceremonial sash and sword. Lee explains, "I'll probably have to be General Grant's prisoner, and I thought I must make my best appearance." With barely 8,000 men left in fighting condition, Lee rides off to command his final battle, which he almost expects to lose. A strange ritual before he can make peace with Grant and with himself. Virginia goes to its end, charging. And once more, men die in a cause their commanders feel is doomed. Now, says Lee, there is nothing left for me to do but to go and see General Grant, and I would rather die 1,000 deaths. Lee rides toward the enemy lines with a white flag fashioned from an old towel. Word of his intention to surrender hasn't filtered through all the lines, and the final shots of the campaign will kill 2 soldiers, one of them a 15-year-old boy. Lee has led his men through the battles of Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, to the horrors of the wilderness, to this, and they still revere him. Nothing, not even defeat, can diminish his legend. But now over them all hangs an unstated question. Is Lee surrendering them to face Union revenge as rebels and traitors? What can they expect at the hands of a man like Grant? That morning, Grant had awakened with another blinding headache, but it disappeared the moment he heard Lee wanted to talk. Grant had not expected the end so soon, so except for 3 tarnished stars on his shoulder straps, he rides to meet Lee in his usual dress, muddy boots and the uniform of a private. Barely 5 years before, Grant had been a clerk in his father's shop. Now, at the head of a great army, he has won a war. Yet he feels sad and depressed. I felt, he said later, like anything rather than rejoicing at the downfall of a foe who had fought so long and valiantly and had suffered so much for a cause. Though that cause was one of the worst for which a people ever fought. Lee is the first to arrive at the surrender scene, Appomattox Courthouse, a tranquil Virginia town that will enter history because of Lee's presence and what will be done here this day. He approaches the home of a farmer, Wilmer McLean, the prearranged surrender site. Lee's back is still straight, the bearings still military. But the long war has taken its toll. His health is gone. The once powerful Virginian is now old beyond his years. Gazing across the valley of the Appomattox in the direction in which he had hoped to escape, Lee patiently waits for Grant with a mute witness, a doll, left behind by one of the McLean children. Half an hour later, as the strains of Old Lang Syne drift over from a Yankee band, Grant arrives. It is 1:30 of a spring afternoon, Palm Sunday. Now he will dictate terms to a general who could have been in Grant's own shoes as head of the victorious Union Army if Lee hadn't chosen another allegiance. But it will be a meeting not only of two military giants, but of two men from different worlds who met once and would never have met again but for this war. And at this climactic moment in history, Grant permits himself a personal thought. He has always remembered the swashbuckling Lee from the Mexican War. Will Lee remember him? When he comes face to face with Lee for the first time in nearly 20 years, Grant can't resist beginning with that question. He reminds Lee that they met once in a long-ago war, and adds that he always remembered Lee. Yes, Lee says, I know I met you, and I have often thought of it and tried to recollect how you looked, but I have never been able to recall a single feature. Years later, however, Grant, normally a man without a trace of vanity, will recall that Lee remembered him very well. It is now time to discuss surrender, and Grant has his officers called in. Out of respect for Lee, almost awe, we walked in softly, one of them said later, very much as people enter a sick chamber when they expect to find the patient dangerously ill. Outside, only a handful of curious civilians gather, for most Virginians in the area had fled because of the fighting that morning. They've all paid heavily for this war. What further price will be exacted? Now Grant, merciless in war, can finally permit himself to be merciful in peace. For the years of killing were somehow never a personal thing with Grant. Lee's men, he says, can return home, and they can take back their horses and mules to work their farms. More important, they are not to be disturbed by Union authorities. In one bold stroke, Grant exceeds his powers as a general. He knows that Lincoln wants to make a humane peace, but Grant takes it upon himself to commit his government to a policy of no reprisals, no vengeance against the revolutionary Lee or any of his men. He didn't hate his enemies, for they too were Americans, and he wants them to be Americans again, in a nation stronger for going through the crucible of war. An intimate of defeat most of his life, Grant can feel for another in defeat, even an enemy. It is one of the noblest acts of the war. Aware and grateful for what Grant has done, Lee accepts the surrender terms. Proud in defeat, Grant generous in victory. The wounds of war hopefully beginning to heal. And so on April 9th, 1865, it's all over. The guns of war are silent. For 4 long years, Grant and Lee, two men from separate worlds of temperament and tradition, led great armies and fought great battles. But now on this late afternoon in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Grant and Lee, like the nation itself, have at last found a common bond in the quiet of peace. It's been said that the human heart is the starting point in all matters of war. And within the hearts of Lee and Grant was played out the struggle of a nation's conscience, as 600,000 men and boys died. It's an old story, the story of a prolonged conflict that almost nobody wanted. It's hard to explore the corridors of the past without coming face to face with ourselves.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.